Hello everyone, Class 6, Chapter Separation of Substances, Part 2. So far we have discussed different techniques of separation of particles, right? We have discussed about hand picking, threshing, winnowing, sieving, etc. So these techniques have its own advantages and disadvantages. So today we will discuss more about these techniques of separation of substances. Okay, the first such technique is sedimentation and decantation. Okay, the word sedimentation is actually obtained from the word sediment, so it has to do something with settle down, that is comes down. So it is basically a process of separation of insoluble particles from water. There are certain particles which does not get mixed or dissolved in water. For example, let us take an example. When we mix sugar or salt in water, after some times it gets completely dissolved in water, right? If we take, instead of sugar, for example, soil or sand, no matter how much you stir, you can still see the sand particles. So sand is insoluble in water. And also we can observe that if we leave the sand water mixture undisturbed for some times, after sometimes we can actually see that all the sand particles get settled down at the bottom, and this settlement at the bottom of these sand or soil particles is called sedimentation. That is, we get clear water at the top of the sand or muddy water, as we can see here in this picture, and the sand particles get settled down. This settlement at the bottom is called sedimentation. Okay, so now as we can see here, in picture, this is the sand particles. Okay, so the sand particles and water are being stirred well. The dark color is actually shows the sand particles. If we leave undisturbed for some times, means all the sand particles, as we can see here, get settled down at the bottom and the clear water is obtained at the top. Okay, so now we want to separate both. For this we actually use the process of decantation. That is, it is a separation process where a layer of liquid is removed. In the above sand water mixture, we can pour all the water that is settled above, that is clear water, at the above portion into another beaker, and both the sand as well as the water are get separated. Okay, so what happens is that the sand being heavy, they actually get settled down at the bottom, and the water, which is being lighter in their weight compared to that of soil, that particles actually get float. Okay, this decantation process can also be used for separating oil and water as well. So if we mix oil and water, no matter how much we stir, we can see that the oil gets floated at the top of the water and the water is settled below. So we can easily remove this oil to another beaker, as we can see here. This oil is being removed to another beaker. Okay, so this is the decantation as well as sedimentation process. Decantation is used to separate two immiscible liquids, as in the case of oil and water, as well as it is used to separate insoluble particles. That is the first case. In the case of soil water mixture, that is, it can be used to separate insoluble particles from the liquids as well. In sedimentation, we just form the two distinct layers, but in order to actually separate them, it has to be followed by decantation. Now, what is the advantages and disadvantages of this process? Okay, so the advantages of decantation is that we can actually separate insoluble solids as well as insoluble liquids. Okay, so for separation as such, it is very advantageous. And the disadvantage is that it is not very effective in separating the components of a mixture completely. Here we have to underline the term completely. That is, if we are given if we are taking the example of muddy water, to clear the muddy water, we can actually separate, and what we get is it water. Okay, but even in that clear water, that is a settled above portion of this water, that is a clear water, as we said, even this water have traces of mud or sand in them, so it is not a complete separation process. Okay, it has the disadvantages that it is not very effective to separate particles completely. Okay, so the next process we are going to discuss here is filtration. Okay, so it is a separation of a solid from liquid by passing it through the pores of a filter. As we can see, our common example is our tea. Okay, the tea powder is actually being passed through the filter, and the tea powder gets settled above, whereas the drinking portion, the liquid portion of the tea is passes through that filter. So filter can be of any object that have extremely tiny pores in them. Okay, these tiny pores, what happens is that these tiny pores actually allow only liquid to pass through it, and it will block all the solid things. That is, here as we can see, the tea powder block all the solid things like in the tea powder on it. Okay, there can be many types of filter. Even we can take a piece of cloth and can be used as a filter as well. Okay, we can notice it in the preparation of paneer. Okay, we are actually making use of cloth, and also filter paper is as well available. So the most common example where we can come across the process of filtration is our water purifier, right? Almost all the home have that water purifier in them. Okay, so water purifier is actually making use of this filtration process. Also, as in the case of tea as well, I already mentioned, and we sometimes uses in the case of juices as well, in order to remove the seeds. Okay, after the juice is being prepared, in order to remove the seeds, we are actually using this process of filtration, right? Okay, so advantages, like all other process, it too has its advantages as well as disadvantages. Advantages that it can separate insoluble or tiny particles from a solution. Okay, this process is very effective in order to separate insoluble as well as tiny particles, but the disadvantage is that it is not very effective in separating soluble substances from solution. It is effective in the case of insoluble, but not very effective in separating soluble substances from solution. Like if we have sugar solution means water that contains sugar dissolved in it. So this process is not advisable in order to separate sugar from this solution. Okay, so next process, in order to separate, so in order to overcome the disadvantage of this filtration, we are making use of next process, that is evaporation. Evaporation is the process of conversion of water into its vapor. Okay, that is, it is a process in which water is heated to get converted into water vapor. For example, we can think the water we drink is in liquid form, right? Now if we start heating the water, means what? After sometimes it starts boiling, and if we continue heat, means what? We can actually observe that the water in the container gradually gets reduced or decreased in quantity. It is because the liquid water is getting converted into water vapor. Okay, so now how is evaporation a way to separate substances? We mentioned that the evaporation is the process of conversion of water into water vapor. Okay, so here we can see okay, we agree that all the water gets converted into water vapor by evaporation. Now how this evaporation is the way to separate substances? Now that we can see by using an example. Okay, so let us take the example, previous example itself. uh, Instead of boiling a water. For this, let us take the previous example. Instead of boiling plain water, suppose you take water that contains salt. That is salt, let the salt be completely dissolved in water. Now, how can you separate this dissolved salt from water? Here, filtration won't help. Hand picking obviously won't help. So, this is where evaporation helps. So when we heat this water containing salt continuously, by the time all the water gets evaporated, that all the water gets converted into water vapor, what happens is that the only thing that will be left behind in this utensil or in this beaker will be the salt. That is, we obtain salt from this process. Okay, so this is a way to separate soluble substances from liquid, unlike filtration, which is to separate insoluble substances. Here it is used to separate soluble substances from liquid. In fact, this is one of the important methods to obtain salt from sea. Now, how do we heat water of the sea? We know sea is very huge and there is a lot and lot of water. So, it is a natural process. That is, the sea, we know, is always exposed to the heat of sun. Okay, so this heat of sun provides the temperature for which the evaporation of seawater takes place. If we go near the shallow area, that is the area but that is not deep of the soil, there will be certain pits that are made, and the seawater is made to settle in that pit for some time, and which will the water of that pit will later be evaporated and the salt thus remains there. Okay, so now when we talk about evaporation, a question might come to your mind that okay, so liquid water is getting converted into vapor. Is the reverse is also true? That is, if we can convert water vapor into water, yes, it is. And the process is called condensation. Okay, now what is condensation? It is the process in which water vapor is cooled to get converted into liquid water. In evaporation, we are heating the water. Here we are actually cooling the water vapor. Okay, these both are just opposite of each other. For example, you may have noticed when we are cooking, while we are cooking, the food inside the beaker or inside the utensil is very hot, and there is also water vapor is also formed. Okay, now suddenly if we cover the hot utensil by using a cold lid or cover, what do you see? We see droplets of water inside this lid. From where do these water droplets come? These water droplets are as a result of water vapor condensing. That is, the lid is actually at a lower temperature, that is cold lid. So basically you are cooling down the temperature, and the water vapor thus condenses to form water, which can be seen at the top of this lid. Okay, so far we have learned discussed about many separation techniques. Suppose you are given, for example, you are given a mixture of salt and sand mixture. Okay, so how will you separate them? So we have discussed about many techniques. We have learned about hand picking. Do you think it is useful in this case to separate salt and sand? Definitely not. So hand picking is not an option. Next process, we can check out all the process. Even sieving, sieving is also will not help since both the particles are equally small, right? So these methods alone cannot be used to separate it. So we have to use more than one technique to separate them. So when we are comparing both this salt and sand means we can see that the salt is actually a soluble thing and the sand is not an insoluble. Okay, so for this what we are doing is that we are making use of more than one process, that is sedimentation and decantation. Okay, so what we are actually doing is that we are actually taking, as we can see here, the salt and soil is mixed, well mixed with the water. Here we can see here. Okay, and stir it well. Okay, so and let the beaker be undisturbed for some time. So what we can see that all the salt inside this beaker will get thoroughly dissolved in water. Okay, the salt gets dissolved in water, and since we are keeping it undisturbed for some time, all the soil gets settled down. That process is called, yeah, sedimentation. Okay, so by sedimentation all the sand are being settled down at the bottom. The next process followed by this sedimentation is what? That is, yeah, that is decantation. So in decantation we are actually separating, as we can see here, all the water is being separated into another bottle. Okay, another beaker we are separating. Here we can, the first component is we got, that is the we got already got the sand. Okay, so now we have to separate this salt from this water. So what was the method to separate soluble things from a solution? Yeah, you got it right. That is this next process, the evaporation. What we are doing is that we are continuously heating this liquid containing salt, and all the water gets evaporated, as we can see, vaporizes, and the salt is left behind in the bowl. Only the salt will remain in this bowl. Okay, so we got sand, we got salt, and now we have to separate this water. Okay, so all the water gets evaporated and is converted into water vapor, right? So now what we have to do, we have to condense, or we have to cool down this water vapor, right? So for this we are using the process of condensation, that is a plate containing ice, in order to bring down the temperature as shown in figure. So what happens is that this, here we are heating this, and the salt remains in this beaker. All the water gets evaporated and is moving up. Okay, and this evaporated water vapor on touching this beaker, sorry, on this plate containing ice, they gets condensed and it is being poured into this beaker. Okay, so in order to separate sand and salt mixture, we are actually making use of sedimentation decantation process. Okay, so last what we have to discuss is about saturated solution. What exactly is a solution? Before saturated solution, what exactly is a solution? We already said sugar solution, saline solution, etc. Okay, so when a substance is dissolved in a liquid, it forms a solution. Example, salt solution, that is salt in water. Sugar solution, that is sugar dissolved in water. So the solid particles that is being mixed in the solution is called solute, and the liquid in which this solute is being mixed is called solvent. And now of saturated solution, suppose if we add 2 spoons of salt, suppose we are an example. Okay, if we are adding 2 spoons of salt in a glass and stir it well, we can see the salt gets dissolved. Okay, later add 2 more salt, again it gets dissolved. Okay, if we continue, if we keep on adding salt, means do you think it will get dissolved? No, it won't. If I take for example a single glass of water, and if I am adding 2 kgs of sugar or kgs of salt, means it will not get dissolved, right? Completely. So there is a limit beyond which if we keep on adding salt, it won't get dissolved, and the salt remains at the bottom of this water. That limit is called actually saturation. Okay, saturation means the upper limit. A solution is said to be saturated when no more solute can be dissolved in the solvent. So that means the solvent has reached its maximum limit, and of how much solute it can dissolve. Okay, so if we keep on adding salt, means as I already said, it once it reaches saturated solution, the salt will settle down at the bottom. Okay, so far we had discussed many techniques about solution, and if we sometimes in our daily life we have to use more than one technique to separate things. Okay, thank you children.